Hello, I'm Michael Hutchison, and I'm going to show you my Unity application, Manic Mike. It's a little endless runner I've just been making. So, starts at the start screen. Tried to mess around with UI elements to make it pop a little bit, just to add a little bit of interactivity. Didn't take much code, it's just mainly screwing around in the Unity editor. The application.quit doesn't work in the Unity editor, so can't really test the quit button until I've exported the game. But if I click start, he plays a little man just running his way through a forest, trying to avoid enemies. Added a little shoot function just to allow the player to defend themselves. The design of the shoot function was just to add a little bit of defense, but at the cost of the score, because the health is at the top left and the score is at the top right. But as you can see, as the enemies go off the screen, they slowly add to the score. So every time you destroy an enemy, it will decrease your score over time. So the objective is to try and reach 25 on the score counter and try and survive for as long as possible. The main point behind the game was I was trying to depict trying to cope with mental health issues or people trying to struggle with them, and so running away, doesn't seem like the best thing to do all the time. So you win, you press R to restart, it destroys all the enemies on the screen. I'll get back to that later. But yeah, the main bug that I'm running into with the game is trying to get more animations to work, and trying to figure out how to get this arrow to not follow the player's position. I'll delve more into that later. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the player script to start with. These are my variables. I've set a lot of them to public just for ease of use and development when I'm trying to change them in the Unity editor. I've got a bunch of game objects here for particle effects, the game over screen, the arrows, and I made a mini little timer system to try and help with time between shots so that the player can't spam the arrows. So here, I'm changing the health UI overlay to a string from a text, just so that it doesn't throw us a nasty error. This is the fail state check, so if the health is less than or equal to 0, then game over object, which is tied to the player, is set active. As you can see here, game over. The game over object is in the canvas, and this is where the panel and the restart screen is that controls whenever the player dies, they can go back to the main menu. And then there's also a win state for the player. The transformed up position, this allows the player to move towards, this is a predefined function kind of that allows the player to move towards the position rather than spawn there. So instead of whenever the player moves up or down and they immediately pop a little bit up and down, this will allow them to move towards that, and you can change the speed at which it does so. So you can either make them move slowly or fast towards the final position. And then here, I've got the movement, which is the up arrow and the down arrow, and it checks to see if their position is less than the max height before it moves it. And that's to stop the player from going off screen, is to really try and make the ending positions a little bit rigid, to try and keep the player on just a track of 3. And then whenever it moves, it would instantiate the particle effect of him like kicking up dust. I had initially made the particle effects here and prefabs. I initially made the particle effects to kind of spew in different directions. So this one would spew down, this one would go up. And so that's why they've got two. There's particle effect 1 for the player moving up, and then particle effect 2 for the player moving down. But I couldn't exactly get the particle effects working the way I intended, because as you can see, it just turned into a little tiny kick of dust. So I've also created a mini artificial timer system here, where it checks if the time between shots is less than or equal to 0. And then if the mouse button is down, it would instantiate the arrow at the arrow position, which is a child to the player. It would then set the time between shots equal to start time between shots, which in the Unity editor I set to 2. And then it would slowly count down from 2 to 0 by minusing time.delta time. And only when it reaches 0 will it allow the player to instantiate another arrow. So it adds a little timer so that only every 2 seconds can the player shoot. So we're going to be delving into the points manager before the enemy, because I've got them interacting with each other in a little way, and the way the flow of code works, it would make more sense with the points manager. So I've got the win state, the players here, and the enemy spawn objects set on the points manager, and I've made a boolean for check win set to false. Down here I've got a getter, which essentially returns the check win. And here I'm changing the score to a string because I chose to keep the score in the points manager section. And then if the score is greater than or equal to 25, then it would set the win state to true, which would load the you win screen. And the enemy spawn is set to false to prevent the enemies from continuing to respawn. And then it would return the check win to true, which is going to be used in the enemy class. And then here we've got the destroy function, which would destroy the other game object, which is the player. And the reason for that is because even though the enemies stop respawning in the background, there's still a few that have been respawned, and they could affect the player. So the player could essentially win and then lose because the UI overlay stopped them from moving. So to prevent that from happening, I decided to just destroy the player whenever they would win. And then I've got the collider, where I've set the enemy. I've set the enemy tag here to be checked for whenever an object has the same tag as the enemy and is collided with, it increases the score. So the way this works is the points manager is an empty object in the back, and whenever the enemy would move to the left and interact with the points manager, it would add to the score. And then I've also got a destructor, which would destroy the game object after a set amount of time, which I set to 10 seconds. That is to prevent the game from becoming really slow, and it's to prevent Unity from crashing, as there's going to be a lot of enemies respawning and going off the screen. Eventually you want to delete anything that's no longer on the screen and no longer usable, and therefore I've attached the destructor object to all the enemies in the game. So now looking at the enemy script, as you can see I've got it interacted with the point manager game object and script, and this is the primary movement for the enemy, which will move them from the right to the left depending on their speed. And if the point manager.getComponent point manager, if the check win is equal to true, then it would destroy the enemy game object. So when the game is won, any enemy object that is currently on the screen will be destroyed and will therefore no longer add to the score or anything like that. And then here I've got the collision for the enemies, where whenever it would collide with the player tag, it will instantiate the particle effect that you saw, which is the enemies kind of splattering into oblivion. And then here, this will also allow the player to take damage, because it's other.getComponent.health minus equals damage, and the damage is set to 1, and the player health is set to 3. So if they connect with 3 of them, they are dead. And then I've got the debug.log, that's just to aid with development, to especially at the start, for when I was needing a bit of feedback as to whether the collisions were working, and then destroy the game object. And if the other.compare tag arrow, so if the enemy makes contact with the arrow, it'll instantiate the same particle effect and just destroy the object. So as you can see from my gameplay, there was two types of enemies, one that moved directly left, one that moved up and down. The idea behind that was to try and make an enemy that was a little bit harder, but also tried to trick the player into doubting themselves based on the enemy movement, because it was a little bit more unpredictable. So doing some research into math functions, I found that I would possibly be able to use the cosine rule to allow get the enemy to wave up and down. So to do that, I found that it would be best to make an origin X position, and that will determine the origin spawn point of the X coordinate of the enemy. And then I took the origin X and equaled it to the transform dot position X. This would essentially ensure that the Y movement of the enemy is based off the start of the cosine graph. And then here, it's just a simple line. This essentially moves and it works to move the enemy up and down based on the values of cosine. So vector2 dot movement equals new vector2 and then -1 5 times mathf dot cos and then the origin x variable minus transform dot position dot x. Okay, and now we will be talking about the enemy respawner. So to start with, I created an empty game object called enemy spawn and placed it over here. And I created an array of game objects, of which I will show what I filled with later. Create a little mini timer system so that it would count down and allow the players to spawn more frequently over time. So if the time between respawn is less than or equal to 0, then it creates a random int, and sets the range to 0 and the length of my array, which is 4. It would then instantiate the obstacle pattern with the rand as an index, and then we take the time between respawn and set it to the start time between respawn, like I mentioned earlier. And then this would essentially make sure that the enemies don't spawn in too fast, and make sure that it is greater than the minimum time, so 0.65. And if that is the case, then it would take the start time between respawn and gradually decrease it by the decrease time variable, which I made to be 0.05. So it starts at 1.25, and then every time the enemies are spawning, it would decrease the time by 0.05 permanently until it reaches the minimum time, which is 0.65. So it would start off at the enemy spawning every 1.25 seconds, and eventually it will work its way down by 0.05 until it reaches 0.65 by taking the time to respawn and minusing it by time.delta time. So to wrap up, in terms of improvements that I'd like to make to the game, I'd like to add a lot more animations, because the main thing that I used the animator for was just the start and quit animations, which I used to make them feel a little bit more interactable and really pop. I'd like to add a bit more animations to the actual gameplay, because at the moment I just had the animation for the player running. I don't really have an animation for anything else. So I'd like to add a bit more robust animations, such as maybe moving up and down. I'd also like to add a few more missions with a bit more artistic flair, or a little bit more assets and enemies that I can use in each mission. I did have an idea for maybe an enemy that moves in a circular motion, but I couldn't really get that working properly. So I just stuck with the cosine graph. I'd also like to add a few more missions that would require an extra 25 points to pass every time the player progressed, and maybe have different respawn patterns for each of the enemies, so that maybe they come in spawns of bursts in one level, or there's kind of the patterns spell out words in some way. Just little nuances to try and keep the player on their toes and keep the challenge running. But other than that, that's everything. Hope you enjoyed looking at my game, and yeah.